USAPL. I know, what's funny is there's actually something I have never told you about USAPL stuff is I actually linked them your video regarding the blood testing, and I actually talked to them about that, and it was pretty interesting. They actually listened, by the way. Now, maybe it's because of me, but initially they were dismissive of you, actually. Like, initially they were like, is this guy a doctor? Is he just some like Reuter or something like that? And I was like, no, he's actually like making good points. And, and I presented it to them, and like, eventually they were like really listening though. Like they were saying like they would look into it. And I think the way that the USAPL is a little bit more open, especially now, the way it's a more true competition for lifters, the way they're giving money, like $10,000, like Ashton Ruska won, $10,000 at a pro meet. I think that's going to be what moves the sport forward. And like I said before, I think Sheffield with the IPF is a great idea. That's going to give the most amount of money ever in the IPF, but it has yet to happen. And I do think it will, but it's like anytime you have one meet where it's just a ton of money, I don't think that changes things as much as those gradual, like regional type of meets.
Yeah, I think the money will help as far as like giving the lifters more incentive to stick to the national federations, because I know that was more of a thing with the non-tested federations at first. That's kind of been a thing lately where, John Hack's winning all the meets, but that's been really interesting that you presented that to them. Cause I look at you in a way of like, you're almost a bridge between like the common man and the USAPL higher ups, in my opinion. You're one of the most respected lifters. You're someone who has a lot of credibility who they would listen to. And I actually think that's kind of cool that they were willing to listen to that.
Yeah. I mean, that's like, I was going to say is that they have, and I won't name names because I never want to like put pressure on people where they're private conversations, but the USAPL, they have some people in the right spots who really do listen. And it's like, you just kind of have to know who you're talking to. So if you just talk to like some types of people, like some of them will be, a little bit more tense. But if you talk to the right type of people, I mean, honestly, like when I was making my USAPL and IPF video, it was to a point to where like one of the representatives was literally texting Priscilla, who's co-owner basically of the USAPL, her and her husband, Larry Mail. Like they were texting to the rep, texting to me like data that I needed, like very immediately. It was actually really interesting. And obviously they did it because they could sense that it was going to be a good thing for them as far as the video. But it was something where it's like, that's the type of thing where that's how you win people over. And it's good that they're like that too. Because to me, you see some federations where they're not really even like that, even if it would make sense. I think weightlifting, I would imagine, is probably like that. Like you never really see a YouTuber in a weightlifting federation like are able to communicate something important and go, hey, here's what the president said this. Like, I don't think it's like that at all. So yeah, that is definitely how I view it. Like that's how I view kind of my role. And, to some extent it's a responsibility, but for the most part, it's just whatever I think. like if the next day I have a different opinion, I'll give it. Yeah.
I think somebody's got to, drive forward the change. So I think, people think I'm like dogging the USAPL sometimes. And honestly, I just want things to be as strict as possible because I've been on both sides of the coin. Like I've taken steroids for 9 years and I've lived that life. And then I've come off and it's been 17 months off everything. So it's just, I know how this works. I know how to spot these things. I know what shows up, what's off and everything like that. So I feel like if we can drive a change to improve how strict the testing is, we'll really clean it up. That's not to say that the USAPL or the tested side of things is dirty in general, but sometimes I wonder if it could be improved by a pretty drastic amount. Because I know, and I'm not one of these people, I don't want to call out people and be like, oh, this guy's a fake natural or whatever. I don't do that. Obviously, people have their preconceived notions as far as that goes. But I think if we really establish some more concrete blood testing, we would find a way around this. Because as far as I'm concerned, I know the urinalysis testing isn't that just metabolite testing? And then the blood testing that was done, that was also metabolite testing. It wasn't like looking into things like my idea was we look into total testosterone levels. We look into free testosterone, estradiol, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, these kind of markers that it's going to be fairly hard to fake. So if someone, I think if there are still ways in which they could be manipulated, like you could take take certain compounds like HCG to fake the LH and all this sort of thing. But for most people, 99% of people are not going to be able to fake their way around this. And there will be, certain levels at which things will be flagged. This, to me, would be the most concrete way of just completely cleaning everything up, because you would expose a lot of people. And I'm not necessarily saying just people at the top, but this would completely filter out most
so
of
do you think
the cheaters.
Is that type of testing done on any sport, on any level? Like,
I think it would work, yes. Because, and that's the thing, I feel like blood work in general is not something that's big at all in the tested federations, or like for natural lifters. From what I've seen, you guys aren't as big into like looking into labs and such, because you don't feel the need to like look at your health. You don't feel like it's as messed up. But I feel like it's something that's interesting as well. Like, wouldn't it be interesting to see what some of these higher level lifters, what their test levels were, like a Russ Ori or Ashton Ruska? Not even saying like they're doing anything, but if it would be interesting to be able to see what gives these people, besides the leverages and just the genetics, what in terms of their lab work is different from your average Joe. And that's another thing that would be fascinating. I'm not saying that would necessarily be necessary for the general public to know, but I don't feel like there's a whole lot of ways around it if you get more concrete blood testing. And it'd be easy to do. USAPL could pair with Merrick Health and like set up a deal where they could get it very cheaply made.
Yes, what I was going to ask you is, why do you think other sports don't do it? Like, let's say, because what I think tends to happen, and you definitely do know more than me about the specifics, and this was actually something that I was thinking that would be funny, is I feel like the best conversation ever would be like me, you, and then Derek of More Plates, More Dates, and then have like all three kind of levels of it, where it's like I'm more of the kind of normal person, like, I know more about kind of the organization specific data, and then in relation to other sports and how they interact, but I don't know as much about the mechanisms, for sure, as much as you and like, someone like Derek would know. And the biggest question that I have from kind of the outsider perspective on that, on like blood work and all that, is why don't other sports do it? Like, do you think other sports just straight up don't do it? Like, I know there are certain situations, like the NFL did not, or maybe still doesn't test for HGH or whatever it was. Like, I know there are certain things where it is kind of almost malicious, where it is like obvious that it's a players union wants to defend their players to a level that just allows them to use. So like, there is some of that. And I think it's important not to be naive from my end of the spectrum on that. But at the same level is, if there was a way like that would work, that the USAPL could afford it, like, why wouldn't Olympic level sports already do it?
That's a good question. I don't know the exact degree that Olympic level testing, what they do. Do they just test for like metabolites of certain compounds, or do they?
Because I think the blood testing is through WADA in the IPF, and it should be the same standard then as the Olympic testing. But it is bizarre, because did you see how for the blood testing in the IPF it caught nobody, literally nobody? I mean, it was 0 out of like 322 in a 4-year period, where it's like they're either not processing it right, or it's like there's got to be something going on that's strange.
And one of the tricky things too with blood testing is you can obviously dilute a sample. So I feel like you would also need the metabolite testing. I think that's a great first step, because it's pretty hard to, like, if you have a trend metabolite in your system, that's not just going to clear instantly. But then again, I don't know how often lifters are getting tested, because one of the things that raised an eyebrow for me is, like, I looked at the USAPL drug test for the last year, I think it was 2021, the whole year. And it was like such a ridiculously low positive percentage, which you could say, okay, well, everybody's clean.
That was unusually low, though. Because that's what I will say, because that's how a conversation with a friend of mine started, was with him linking your video. And I would say I'm in between on that, because that was the worst one. Like, that was during the COVID issues, because every other year it was basically, the breakdown was for non-WADA tests, it was around 1 in 100 caught. And then for WADA tests in America, it's like around 1 in 75 caught, something like that. And then in like Germany, it's 1 in 42, somewhere around those numbers generally. Now, the year you were talking about, it was well under 1 in 100. It was like 1 in 400, right? It was
that was last year too, 2021.
Yeah. But I think with COVID, I do think that's an abnormal situation. at least. Yeah, I would think, because every single year prior, like, and there were bigger numbers too. Like every year prior, it'd be something like 38 caught out of 3,500. It was like very consistently those numbers. So
the other interesting thing though too, like I looked at the compounds that were getting popped, and a lot of the compounds were things that were more mundane, like diuretics, like lisinopril and stuff like that, where I'm just like, this isn't even helping them. Like I mean, lisinopril you could call a masking agent in terms of being a diuretic, but diuretics really aren't going to help your performance at all. Whereas like more concrete things like SARMs and such would. And I don't know, it was interesting. And one other thing that was like kind of interesting to me was for Raw Nationals last year, I looked at like exactly who they tested, and I don't understand, because like there'd be like one of the bigger name guys on there, and then the other guys wouldn't be on there at all. So how does that? Because there was one positive test at Raw Nationals, one, which I'm like, that's the biggest meet by far. That's the best lifters and the biggest meet. And one guy gets caught. That's I don't know. That's where I start to think. And I again, I'm not trying to be a pessimist in terms of everyone is cheating and we have to, because people take this to the extreme, obviously. I'd like to think that morally, ethically, most people are not doing that. I don't even think it's like, 25% are cheating. That's ridiculous. But I just think, there starts to get a more of a blurred line too when people see, okay, well, the tested numbers are higher than the untested, or they're equal, and then no one's getting caught. So as far as like at Raw Nationals, I guess, how do they do the testing? Because a lot of the big names were not even on the sheet as far as passing or getting popped.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think because of the fact that they have a certain percentage at all levels of meets, they have a certain percentage, obviously, that they test. Every federation says 10%, but USAPL tests a little bit above 10%. Other ones test below 10%. But the biggest disadvantage I see with that is, since there's not a disproportionate amount of funding for those bigger meets, you're actually less likely to be tested as someone like Taylor Atwood versus someone like myself when I was coming back from injury. Because this is actually a funny story, is when I was coming back from my back injury, when the biggest like wave of coming back was like 2018 or so, something like that. And every single meet I would win, since I'm doing like local meets. So I'd do the Ray Williams Classic, total like 1,500. Then I would do the next meet, total 1,550. Then total 1,590. Then 1,600. And then 1,640. Every single meet I was drug tested. And it was actually really funny, because I was like, I was probably the most drug tested lifter in the USAPL that year by far. I was literally drug tested at least 5 times in 1 year.
Is that because of your following?
No, I think it's just because in proportion to the meet. That's what I think that's the problem, is that if you have a meet like a Raw Nationals, they'll see like Ray Williams, Taylor Atwood, Russell, Ashton, and then maybe they'll test one and then that's it, because they have so many options. And because I definitely don't think, I mean, that would be funny if there was a connection like that, but I think it is, what I'm saying, I think is pretty consistent, because if you look at guys like, I know Hack has said this before, and if you look at Brett Gibbs as well, those guys don't get tested nearly as much as people think. And that's like very clear. Like I remember John Hack himself said, he's like, I haven't been tested in like 1 to 2 years or something. He's like, you could easily use while in this, because someone thought that they actually get drug tested a ton. So I do think that it's an interesting situation, because it is part of their whole philosophy of like, well, we test everybody. And like, that's kind of the point. So I think there's probably a solution that's in between on that for sure. Because I do remember, especially Taylor Atwood specifically, like I was almost going to make a point within the same video about how I think a guy like Taylor Atwood's natural just because I believe him, and not because, like, I'm never the type of person who's going to be like, I think Taylor Atwood's natural because he competes in a drug tested, blah, blah, blah. Like, it's a factor, but it's certainly not proof.